All right, good to see everybody this morning. Got a great crowd for Bible study. Glad everybody's here. I did put a new sheet on the back table that gets us into chapter 9 of Genesis in the life of Noah. Today we are in the last part of chapter 8. And if you did not get a chance to grab a copy of those notes, which we are covering today, you're welcome to grab a copy. There's actually a significant stack of notes on the back. So I assume a lot of folks did not get it last week, but we are covering verses 20 through 22, really verses 20 and 21 today in our study of the life of Noah. So be turning your Bible to Genesis chapter 8. Genesis chapter 8. I have really loved the section between lesson 6 and lesson 7 and lesson number 8 on Noah saving his family. That's been a great discussion. We spent a lot of time in chapter 7, the end part of chapter 6, chapter 7, and most of chapter 8 on that section of Noah saved his family. We had three different sets of notes and a lot of lessons in between that. And it was a good discussion. I really appreciate that. We talked a lot about Noah and what he would have perceived and how he would have been in that situation. And then we also talked about the physical part of it, the water and where the water went to. And we rounded out our discussion last week on that. But the very last point we were making was, we cannot forget the humanity of Noah in all of that. That Noah was a human being. And to hear the things that he heard and see the things that he saw, to have experienced what he experienced was no doubt a life-changing series of events and a great discussion. So today we shift gears a little bit, and in verse 20 we notice there's sort of a change in what we've been talking about. Now we're off of the ark, and so life is going to be a little bit different, which we talked about some of the changes he would have experienced in the world. But verses 20 through 22, we're talking about how in lesson number 9, Noah worships God. So we're going to learn some things, really be reminded about things about worship today. It's not like we're learning them for the first time, but this is a great section to remind us of some things about worship. So let's read verses 20 through 22, and then we've got a couple of, 3 discussion questions in our notes, and we'll go back and take a look at those. Okay, verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. And our goal today is not really to talk about verse 22. In fact, I don't remember, it was probably, maybe 3 Sunday nights ago, we had a lesson where we talked about the providence of God. And one of the points we made about God's providence is like 4 different ways in which God is involved in the world providentially. And one of them is through sustaining the earth. And we see that in verse 22. About the seasons and the changing of the seasons and the cold and the heat and such. So we'll not talk about that really today. Our focus today is on worship and what Noah did after he got off the ark. So here's question number 1 in the notes. If you've got a copy of the notes, this is question number 1. Number 1, Noah built an altar to worship God. Chapter 8, verse 20 and following. Just like others in the Old Testament. How can we use this to build a word picture of worship? What is worship? Also, what problems could we solve or correct by understanding God's picture of worship? So if we get the word picture right, then how does that help us practically when it comes to worship, and particularly about our behavior, our attitude, things of that sort? All right, let's deal with the first part. What is worship? What's the word picture? Joel, see your hand sort of slightly up. He did? Yep. Yes. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, and what Joel is saying is that we're going to make a whole entire point about this in just a moment. I think we can look at this text and we could know how we define what is and what is not acceptable worship. And I think Joel is right on the mark there about how we would know what is right worship and what is wrong worship. And there are some indications in this text, and then he made reference to Cain and Abel, and we'll go back and we'll take a look at them in just a minute. Is there any language here that might help us to build a word picture for worship? Is there a term or two, or maybe just a word that helps us to understand worship? What do you think the key word is? Especially in verse 20. What do you think the key word is here? Okay, sacrifice. What about the word altar? In the Old Testament, every time somebody was worshiping God, what did they build? They built altars to the Lord, okay? And I think there is within that sort of a veiled reference to this overarching word picture the Bible builds about worship, okay? Is worship for us, let's make it modern and then we'll go back. Is worship for us just coming in and sitting on a pew, a padded pew? Is that what worship is? Okay. We have to come here, or we don't have to, but we're here because we set this up as a place where we come together, but that's not what worship is. Is worship just physically taking grape juice and unleavened bread, and is it just putting it in the mouth and letting it hit the tongue? Is that all worship is? There's something deeper about worship, okay? So there's obviously some sort of an exterior physical component, and the altar would tell us that, but there's something happening that's much deeper than just the altar itself. The word altar here, and I think it's interesting because this connects to what Joel was saying about sacrifice. The word altar here is the word that means a place for slaying animals, which tells us what kind of sacrifice is being made. An animal sacrifice, a blood sacrifice is being made. So in fact, in verse 20, he tells us that he's doing animals because it says of every clean animal and of every clean bird. So there's animals being killed. There's blood being shed, and they're being offered up to God. In Hebrews 9, verse 22, the Bible tells us that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. All right, so this connects to some of the things we talked about when we studied Hebrews, which is they had to offer animal sacrifices because they were connected in the system to Jesus. They always pointed toward the cross to connect to the cross of Jesus Christ. But in and of themselves, according to Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 4, they were unable to offer the forgiveness of sins, except that they were connected to Jesus. And that's what Romans 3 and Revelation 13:8 are all about. That Jesus, in the view of God, is dying on the cross, and those animal sacrifices are they're the types, the foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. So they did, as they connected to Jesus, have some efficacy, but only it was the blood of Christ. But our blood offering today is once for all. Of course, that's Jesus, Hebrews 10, verses 10 through 19. But the altar is important for our word picture. Hold your place with me real quick, right here in Genesis chapter 8, and turn to John chapter 4. John chapter 4. And if we build the word picture, it helps us to understand what Noah was doing. It helps us to understand what he was doing in chapter 8, verses 20 and 21. All right, so John chapter 4. You know this story. This is the woman at the well. He's interacting with this woman. She's a Samaritan woman. There's all the distinctions that would have been made between Jews and Gentiles, or Jews and Samaritans, and Jesus broke that barrier, obviously, because people are people with souls, and it's clear that he's interested in saving her based on the conversation down through verse 22. Then he says this, verse 23, because her worship would have been wrong. She worshipped at Mount Gerizim. Her worship would have been very corrupted. It would have been an alternate to the Jewish religion. And Jesus bounds beyond that. He says, the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Now, the last part of that we'll talk about in just a moment, that spirit and truth, because I think that goes directly to what Joel mentioned earlier. But he uses the word worship here. Worship the Father in spirit and truth, seeking such to worship him. There's that word again, verse 24, those who worship him. So that word is used about 3 or 4 times there. The word here literally means to blow kisses It had sort of a pagan context. In a non-biblical sense, it meant to blow kisses toward deities with outstretched arms. So the idea is to, with outstretched arms, blow kisses toward a deity. Well, Jesus is obviously using that of the one true God here. But here's the interesting part about this word. It has a connecting word in the Old Testament. There's an Old Testament word that is the parallel to this word that meant to blow kisses with outstretched arms. So I'd like to show some examples of that Old Testament word, and I think it helps to build the word picture. If we add the altar to it, it builds this wonderful word picture that helps us today, even in worship. So go back with me to Genesis chapter, Genesis chapter 18. Just a couple of examples. Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18. Go to the very beginning of the chapter, please. Genesis chapter 18. Look at verse 1. Then the Lord appeared to him by the tabernacle trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them. And he did what? And he bowed himself to the ground. That word's important. That word is an equivalent term in the Hebrew language for the word worship in the New Testament. But here it's translated bowed himself down. So he's bowing down in the presence of what he perceives as someone greater than himself. All right, so you know the conversation. He's going to have an heir. At the end of that chapter, he's going to destroy the cities God is. And so he and Abraham talk and come down to, the 10 righteous souls. All right, go to chapter 19. Those 2 men that came with him were angels, we believe. They're the same ones that appear in chapter 19. But look at chapter 19, verse 1. Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and what? That's the same word back in chapter 18, verse 2, that he bowed down himself with his face toward the ground. So he's prostrating himself toward the ground, right, in the presence of what he perceives as someone greater than himself. It's a show of respect. You bow down in the presence of someone greater. Okay. Turn to chapter 22. Of all the stories with Abraham, this may be one of the more familiar because it involves Isaac. And in verses 1 and 2, this is when God appears to Abram and says, I want you to take Abraham, and he says, I want you to take your son, and I want you to take him on one of the mountains of Moriah and offer him for a sacrifice. And according to verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. He took 2 young men with him, and Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And this is really important. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, the lad, and I will go yonder and what? Worship. Did you know that word worship translated here is the same one translated bowed in chapter 19, verse 1, and bowed down in chapter 18, verse 2, which means that in worship, there's something more than just whatever outward expression God requires. There's something inwardly taking place, which means that in worship, what are we doing before God? We are bowing down before God. Joel, see your hand?
I thought it was instituted. According to Strong, this is the first time that the word worship
is translated.
we found example.
Yeah. The word, it appears here, but we have that word translated bowing down before, and I think God's building us a word picture for worship. So in worship, there is a bowing down. A bowing down is taking place. And according to the New Testament, with that word, with outstretched arms, blowing kisses. Except we're not blowing kisses. In our hands, what are we offering before God? Sacrifices. We're offering sacrifice before God. There's something in our hands, because worship, according to the entire Bible, the word picture is a spiritual bowing down and an altar. And of course, an altar, you have sacrifices on an altar. Now, the blood sacrifice for us today has been taken care of. But according to Hebrews 13:15, that passage says, we offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually. That is the fruit of lips. That is, we're offering thanksgiving to God. And of course, we have specifics in the New Testament that are different, the Lord's Supper and the prayers and the preaching, and we have all the singing and the contribution. We have these things in the New Testament, but we are offering those before the throne of God. So we know that when Noah in chapter 8 verse 20 gets off the ark and he's building an altar, spiritually what's he doing before God? He's worshiping God and he's bowing down in his soul and his mind before God. And there's a reason why we're bowing down. Worship is a very distinct, very unique time. While we walk with the Lord, if we're in fellowship, we're walking with God every day. But worship is an interesting time because we are going, according to Hebrews 4:16, directly before the throne of grace. It's a very unique time. It has a beginning and an ending, and we are bowing before the throne of God. And the reason we bow is because we are now on holy ground, right? Because you remember the story in Exodus 3? Moses goes up on the top part of the mountain when he sees the burning bush, and God said, you take your shoes off because you're on holy ground. And it wasn't the bush that was holy, and the ground itself wasn't holy. It was only holy because of the presence of God. So when we come before the presence of God, it should be a life-changing moment because we are bowing before the throne of God. So we can be sitting on pews, and we might be physically putting unleavened bread and juice in our mouth, and there's a physical component to that, and we're using our vocal cords to sing out loud because that's required. But those are all part of sacrifices that we, with outstretched arms, are laying before the throne of God. Now, if that's the word picture, should that shape our attitude and our behavior in worship? What kind of things might that correct for us? Yes, Art? Yeah. Is being on the cell phone and checking Facebook posts and posting on Facebook the best? Is that the best time during worship? No, because where am I in worship? I'm before the throne of God, and there's an order of priority, right? There's a time and place for that. And sometimes, somebody will post something, and you go back on a Sunday afternoon and check, and you're like, wait a minute, when they posted that, they were in worship when they posted that. How are they posting that in worship? We're before the throne of God, and it ought to shape our behavior. Anything else? Yes, Gloria? Sorry. Yes. That's right. That's a great point. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. That's an excellent point. Let's say that, just playing off of that, and then Tommy had a comment. And regardless of your politics, right? Let's say that you get invited to the White House to meet some prominent dignitary, right? And maybe it's maybe you could just, not the president, but maybe your favorite politician or your favorite senator or whatever. But you get to go to the White House and you get to meet somebody. Would you prepare for that? Would you be excited about going to that? You'd be excited, right, to go? Well, should we feel that way about worship? Like we get up on a Sunday morning and we're going to the house of the Lord, and I get to go before the throne of God today. And I'm going to bow before His throne with outstretched arms, and I'm going to offer my sacrifices to Him. That's a special moment. And I think, Gloria, to your point, I think that's an excellent point, that we ought to be prepared for that. I want to feel good, and I want to be rested, and I want my mind to be fresh and prepared for that. Good point. Tommy? It is purposeful.
It's never a happenstance.
No.
And there are those who have been led astray in the belief that everything that we do is worship.
Yeah.
And in Romans 12,
I understand.
Paul talks about we need to present our
Service.
our service. And there are translations that have, instead of service, they have worship.
I know.
And that has led a lot of people
Yeah.
to believe that everything we do is worship. Brushing your teeth is worship.
Right.
Cutting your grass is worship.
And if we go back to Abraham said to the young men, we're going to worship, and then we're coming back. The implication, we're coming back from worship when we do that. So, yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's not. Look, the word latreo means service. There's a better translation of that.
I was just going to say, there's a need to a great degree of reverence.
There is, and that's the point we're trying to make. This is I mean, obviously, we revere God at all times. But worship is a unique time because it's when we come before the throne of grace. We spiritually are prostrating ourselves before the throne of God. And it ought to take care of our behavior. Any of the men who serve and stand up can tell you that the perspective from up here is different than sometimes the perspective down here because you see everything. And I have been in gospel meetings where I was in one where a lady literally, I was in this congregation every time I was there. She would get the newspaper and she would just pull the newspaper out and read the newspaper in the back. And I tried to find interesting ways to get that newspaper out of her hand before, there's one service I said, "Oh, is that today's paper? I haven't got that. Could I get, I just tried to find some way to do that, to keep her from doing that." I've known people who, this is their weekly fingernail clipping time. This is when they clip. I've seen people with just piles of fingernails, and that's what they do. They just clip their fingernails during worship. Or whatever. And I was in a gospel meeting once. There were two teenagers sitting on a back row, and they were just near making out on the back seat. And I literally just stopped preaching, and it was really awkwardly quiet. And they stopped. But this is not. You shouldn't be doing that anyway. But this is not the time for that, because if we started thinking in terms of we are bowing before God's throne, it would change the way we act during worship. It would be reverential and it would be respectful. But I think that word picture, and that's what Noah was doing. Noah gets off, and as he's building an altar, there's preparation, but he's getting ready to bow before the throne of God and show respect to God. And I just think that word picture is important for us. All right, here's number two. Number two, what can we conclude about the purpose of worship from chapter 8, verse 21? Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. Who's the audience, and what problems would this solve for us today if we kept the proper audience in mind as we worship? So verse 21, and the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although his imagination or the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done." What's the purpose of worship? Satisfy God. Okay, that's the purpose of worship. It's to honor and praise God. In verse 21, who is it that smelled the aroma? God did. God did. Worship is always for God. Now, not everyone does. Not every worship, even though worship, we are created with an innate desire to worship God. We have this, all of us do this desire to connect with our Creator. So in every pseudo-religion, in every anti-religion philosophy, there's always a worship that's connected to that. Even in evolution, what is the worship? They worship science, but there's still worship that takes place. There's still reverence and awe that's being, they're bowing down before that. But Muslims, although they're not worshiping the one true God, there's this desire. It's a misdirected desire, right? It's a false desire. The desire is there, but they're falsely directing it. But everybody does that. In Acts chapter 17, verse 22, you've got Paul on Mars Hill, and he's talking about the folks that they worshiped in ignorance. And he said, you've got this altar with this inscription to the unknown God. I want to tell you about him. But everybody has built-in desire to worship. But not everybody's desire is directed at the Lord himself, but worship should be. Tom? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, it's never going to be done because we're made in the image of God, and we have this built-in innate desire to worship. Now again, it can be misdirected, but worship is supposed to be, the audience is the Lord. That's what we were created to do. We'll never be satisfied until we're directing it to the Lord in the proper way. But the Bible just repeatedly reminds us, sometimes we don't emphasize these parts of those verses, but the Lord is the audience. In John 4:23 and 24, the Father is seeking such to worship Him. He's the audience of our worship. Worship is directed to Him. And that's what Noah's doing right here in verses 20 and 21. In Colossians 3:16, we emphasize the earlier parts. teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. But it is to the Lord. He's the audience of our worship. So worship is to glorify and honor and praise and thank God. That's what it's for. And when we forget our purpose, when we forget what the purpose of worship is, then it always results in a change of worship, because the purpose is what keeps us grounded to the truth. We become focused on ourselves and not on the Lord, because then people start saying things like, well, I didn't get anything out of that, and I was bored today in worship. It's because they forget that they are not the audience of worship. It's the Lord who's the audience of that. David?
I've often thought about the sacrifices of the Old Testament. And somewhere along in the life of everybody, they probably went to watch these animal sacrifices and walk away thinking, I just didn't get much out of this. And it's because we're turning and looking at ourselves as opposed to directing it toward God.
Yeah, and that's always a struggle. The struggle is to put yourself up on the throne and to be the recipient of it, and to try to find personal satisfaction. Now, we would say that according to the Bible, if it's done right and it's being directed with the right attitude and to the right audience, there's always personal satisfaction that comes out of it. There's always a joy that comes out of it. But you're right, it's a struggle that all of us face.
I think part of it is due to our culture. I'm not saying that it started with our culture, but
Right.
part of it is because our culture, people trying to get someone to maybe come to service lawyer saying, well, you will get this out of it.
Yes.
We do this, we really have a good time.
Yeah.
No, so it is generated at the person,
Yep.
not God.
Yeah. Hold that thought. I want to make a point about that. I think you're onto a really great point right there. So let's hold that thought. I'm going to come back to it in just a second, because I think it needs to be made, because I think that's the trend that's happening now with some in the church. What happens is, if we forget that God is the audience, worship becomes a performance-based type of thing, right? It becomes and then that's when you start seeing the changes that are intended, like David was just saying, they're solely intended to please me, to make me happy with the worship. And so you start seeing performance-based things, changes in the music, changes in preaching, and things of that sort, all to honor men, but not to honor God. And when Noah offered his sacrifice, where was it going? Up to the Lord, up, so to speak, to the Lord, because it was offered to him. Now, the other problem is this, and I'm 100% totally convinced of this. So I'm going to take Tommy's point and put it in what I'm about to say, and put it right here, and I'm going to work toward it, because I think he's making an excellent point about the reason that people sometimes change worship. Is Christianity all about? Is it just about worship? No. Where is worship? What is worship? It's a very specific act. Worship is part of our service, right? All worship is part of our service, but not all service is worship, and that's what your point was earlier, right? We serve the Lord. Worship is an outgrowth of a faithful life. If we're living faithfully, then worship is the natural product of a life that's being lived in faithfulness to the Lord. For example, if you read Genesis 12, Genesis 13, and you follow those chapters, everywhere that Abraham went, what was he building? An altar. Why was that? Why? To worship God. What was that an outgrowth of? Was he faithful? He was a faithful man. And faithful people worship God. Worship is always an extension, an outgrowth of faithful service. Art, I saw your hand. Of course it is. Yes, always. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Turn to Genesis chapter 4. Gene, go ahead while we're turning. Sure. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of reasons for that. And some of it is directly the fault of the parents of that generation who've sacrificed their kids to the world. They've prioritized material and worldly things over the church. And so when you grow up with that worldview, by the time you reach that age, the church doesn't mean anything. The Lord doesn't mean anything. And you're right about that. Statistically, we're in bad shape when it comes to that segment, Gen Z or whatever they're called. But there's a lot of fault to be passed around for that. Look at chapter 4 of Genesis. Look at verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I've acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. The Lord had respect to Abel and his offering. He did not respect Cain and his offering. Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. And then, of course, you remember the tragedy that follows as a result of his uncontrolled rage here. Go back to verse 4 and 5. What we typically emphasize here, and it's not bad to emphasize it because it's one of the points that God makes, is that there was an offering that was accepted and there was an offering that was not accepted. And we go to Hebrews 11:7, where it talks about, or Hebrews 11:4, by faith Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. We read those verses. But look carefully. Verse 4, and the Lord respected, there's two things that he respected here. Before he respected the offering, what's the first thing he respected? The man. He respected the man. And then look at verse 5. But he did not respect Cain and his offering. Before he ever rejected Cain's offering, what had he first rejected? Cain. And if you read, 1 John 3:12 and a number of other passages, it said Cain belonged to the wicked one. What was Cain's lifestyle like? Was he faithful? He was not a faithful man. And his unfaithfulness produced worship that was not faithful. And when Cain was righteous, or Abel was righteous, his righteous living produced faithful, consistent, righteous worship. And so there's a connection, but worship is always an outgrowth of faithful service. That's what it is. Art? Oh, same instructions. Absolutely. But that goes to his lifestyle. He's a guy that rejected the Word of God. You're exactly right about that. When we get to John 4:23 and 24, when he says worship God in spirit and in truth, truth is the Bible. That's the spirit revealed part. What's the spirit there? Because he's talking to a woman who's living in sin. What's that mean, spirit? What's it a reference to? Her living. That's what it's a reference to there. It's a reference to the fact that she needs, because remember he said, you've had 5 husbands. The man you have now is not your husband. You need to get out of unrighteous living. You're not living right. The principle has always been worship is always the product of faithful service. Okay, so here's the point. I'm going to go back to Tommy's point now. And of course, you've got Noah. Noah's offering exactly what God intended, but what kind of guy was Noah? He was an upright guy. He was a faithful man. And you see worship now as the byproduct of a faithful lifestyle. There are a lot of congregations that have so blended with the world, and I don't say this to be ugly, it's just the truth. They have so blended with the world, they have, and I mean their lives, they are just like the world. They have no converting power at all, none, okay? Because our number one most influential tool for converting others is what? Your behavior. It's the one thing that can draw people in and make them interested in truth. And then, of course, you speak the gospel to them. But if you lose that, what's happening as a congregation, when congregations become like the world in their living, what do they change to try to appeal to the world? The worship. And that's to Tommy's point, that they change the worship to appeal to the world because they don't have any converting power because they're not living like the world. And when they're just like the world, the only thing they have to do to try to draw people into a church building is the next best gimmick, and that's what's happening in a lot of places. And so they change the worship to draw people instead of drawing people through a powerful life. Yep. Yeah, of course that's what he did. He was so afraid to lose people, he changed the worship in 1 Kings 12. It's exactly, it even says that's exactly what he was thinking, lest they go back and under Rehoboam. That's exactly what he was thinking. All right, question number 3 real quick. Why did God take this as and I love this language here in chapter 8, verse 21. Why did God take this as a soothing aroma? What does that mean? What makes worship acceptable or unacceptable? What's that mean there? Yeah, all right. That's right. 100%. Yeah. You savor the moment. We use that language, and I think that's the language that's being used here. Somebody up here was saying something. Anybody else? Joel? Pleasing aroma? Yeah. Yeah. Now, question, did God literally smell that? Does God have nostrils to smell with? He's a spirit being. He doesn't have physical qualities. This is what is called, and it's a big jaw-breaking term, it's called anthropomorphism in the Bible. It's when you assign human attributes to God, and whose benefit is that being listed there for? It's for ours. God doesn't really have a nose, and He doesn't really have eyes and ears, because He's a spirit being. He's an invisible spirit being, so He doesn't have physical qualities, but it's being stated this way, just like Art said, because we can identify with that. We know what that means. The word soothing aroma, and I think this goes, Joel mentioned ESV there about pleasing, literally means an odor of satisfaction. It is a satisfying smell. Okay, so He's very pleased with what's being offered. Now, why was He pleased with this? Okay, who told Noah to save those animals aside for offerings? God did. Remember back in chapter 7, He goes, and of certain animals, don't just take 2, take with you 7 pairs of these because you need some for sacrificial purposes. So He did that. And so worship is only ever acceptable when you have the right lifestyle. You know, He accepted Abel, and then He accepted his offering, and then you have to have the truth or the action. So the truth is, not all worship is accepted to God. God doesn't see all worship as a smoothing or soothing smell. He doesn't do that. We've had examples of that in the Bible, but only worship that is in harmony with His will, offered out of righteous living, will ever be accepted to Him. Genesis 4 is the premier example of that. But I think here you get some insight into Noah, because Noah is a righteous man offering exactly what God wanted, and when he did that, God was very pleased with his offerings. Any other points we want to make? Just thought we ought to pause today and note some of those great things. All right, so chapter 9 beginning. We've got some notes, and we'll probably sluggishly plug through these notes because we've got a lot of things to say about each of these. One of the things coming up next week is about the dread, verse 2, the dread of the animals toward man. What's that mean? And then we're going to talk about some of the dietary things that God restricted or lifted coming up. And then we're going to talk about, we'll probably have an entire class where God says to Noah, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, which is about capital punishment. And we're going to talk about that. What does God teach about capital punishment? Are there principles in the Bible? Because God at the very beginning with Noah is saying, here are some principles that you can relate to society, and we'll talk about that coming up. Yes, Tom.
22, while they were standing in the seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, winter, day and night shall not cease. Doesn't that kind of throw cold water on some of the end of the world things that are being taught now that you see on TV?
Yeah,
Sort of seems
yeah.
to counteract that.
Yeah, I guess in a way we could kind of put that along with the world's not going to end until God speaks it so. And until then, verse 22, everything's going to continue seasonally, and the sun and the moon and the stars and the all that's going to happen. So yeah, maybe in a way we could connect it to that. But yeah, just because there are upheaving world events is no indication of the end of the world, that's for sure. Okay, thank you for your input today. Excellent comments, and we'll pick up with the new notes next week. Thank you guys, appreciate it.